Kush Sovereignty Black Righteousness. By L. James Bolin. Chapter 3 Part 1. Betrayal and Obedience. Samuel was quiet for a moment, and it appeared as if he had started talking to himself. They were more separated than united, he said, pointing at Kush. Let me say this. This United States we live in was divided in every aspect of the word. They were divided by the color of their skin, race, financial status, and political parties. Back in the days, they had some fool running for president whose slogan was, "Make America Great Again." Our people were asking, when was it great for us? The United States should have been called the Divided States of America because even the division was divided, and that division caused its downfall. Kush looked at Samuel, and he laughed. Just thinking out loud, son. How fat people were at war with the skinny, dark-skinned versus light-skinned, rich versus the poor. But never mind that for now. Samuel leaned back in his chair and pointed at Kush. Lean back and rest, son, I've got a lot to tell you. As he continued, this was before they made these bubbled cities, but it wasn't until King Joseph of Old Ireland became king that the word Wacatillians was first mentioned in modern history books. Now don't misunderstand. We got away from having authority figures like kings, queens, presidents, and all that during the Latronculian War, or some would call it World War III. Samuel waved his hands in the air carelessly. But old King Joseph was the great-great-grandson of someone who was of the so-called royal family back in the day, and he did something extra special to, or for, the Abenians to reclaim that title. Anyways, Mr. King Joseph was just a simple computant. Samuel said with his fingers up to motion quotes before saying, he had that special DNA, elite tier 1, shit and thought he was number 1, he hated any type of authority other than his own. They also knew him as a cold-hearted, self-centered, arrogant, narcissistic, egotistical, and drunken whoremonger, and any other negative term you can find. Until he met Chi from the clan of Kamaria, it was often said that he wasn't the brightest light in the room, if you know what I mean. Kush said, no, I don't. Samuel shook his head, it means he wasn't too bright. But Chi, on the other hand, was a strong Wacatillian woman who demanded respect and never settled for anything less. Chi was the total opposite of her oldest sister, Ella, a concubine slave by choice who was already in King Joseph's palace. She was the Queen of Ireland for 3 years, give or take a couple of months, when she was murdered as the first wife of King Joseph and given the title of Greatest Maiden Peer of Old Ireland. Samuel became animated. Kush laughed at Samuel as he talked in a European dialect, and Samuel smiled back at him. You see, in ancient England, they had a system whereby your inheritance gave you a special position. This inheritance classified you as being royalty. King Joseph adopted this same system. Samuel scratched his head. Or was it his father? Anyway, King Joseph is the one who married our ancestor. They brought back this system, but it died before King Joseph's death. Their marriage and her execution made her a historical figure in the first political and religious upheaval that led to the Computan separation from Abenian authority and rule. She was the daughter of Shaka and his wife Lizzie, who was from Southern Ireland, proud descendants of the Twa tribe. Chi wasn't her real name. Her real name was Anaya, but everyone called her Chi for future references. You can call her Queen Anaya, the first. We'll get to the other two later. Samuel paused. You see, back then, the Abenians, hell everyone, saw Wacatillians as inferior and as nothing more than property. So, you can imagine how they felt about Queen Chi, a Wacatillian woman who was now married to their king. As Samuel continued to speak, he noted that things were never easy for Queen Chi. She had to endure countless attempts on her life, including an assassination attempt by her own sister, Ella. Queen Chi had to be vigilant and on her toes at all times, but despite all the dangers and difficulties, she remained a strong and influential leader. Kush listened intently to Samuel's story, fascinated by the rich history and the struggles that his ancestor had endured. As Samuel continued his tale, Cush felt a deep sense of pride in his heritage and the legacy of his people. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but he was inspired by the resilience and determination of his people, and he was ready to carry on their legacy of unity and equality for all people. Samuel pulled out his footstool and rested his legs. The story goes that King Joseph often made trips to southern Ireland to replenish his cabinets with fresh fruits, herbs, homemade beers, and fine liquors. There, he met Chi and fell madly in love with her, not caring that she was Wakatilian because, as always, it was against the law to marry one. Still, he could have won her as a slave. So, he began pursuing Chi, but she resisted his attempts to seduce her. She refused to be anyone's concubine, and her dreams were to become an influential leader of her people. She rejected all his advancements and respectfully confronted the king. It soon became the one object of King Joseph's desire to change his whoremonger ways to marry Chi. Samuel paused. Let me stop right there. You can't make a hoe into a housewife. In this case, a husband, for she knew who he was, but ignored the signs. He had already been with her sister. But anyway, I guess. Chi thought he would change. Hell, I don't know. We would have to ask her. Plus, Sabaoth had his hand in the decision, or else you and I wouldn't be here. However, when it became clear to Abani Alpha 23, an elite Abenian who governs this section of the world, that King Joseph was trying to marry a Wakatilian, all hell broke loose. He demanded that their engagement end, or else they would separate themselves from the complaints of old Ireland, leaving them to fend for themselves. This threat didn't sit too well with the king, and out of drunken anger and contempt toward the Abenians, King Joseph married Chi, made her queen, and granted her the title of the greatest of the great maiden of old Ireland. Shortly afterward, Abani Alpha 23 decreed sentences for excommunication against King Joseph and his entire territory. Because of this marriage and these excommunications, they officially broke off their ties with the Irish Computans. After being crowned Queen Chi of Old Ireland, she gave birth to Queen Anaya, the first, almost a year later. Back then, men always wanted their firstborn to be boys, and her gender disappointed him. It did not entirely discourage him, for he said a son would surely follow and professed to love his daughter Anaya. Once the royal baby was born, Queen Evelyn, King Joseph's mother, along with governors and generals of each Commonwealth nation, was informed along with the rest of the royal family in her family. There was chaos in the streets by this time because the people started feeling the effects of not having the Abenians' technology, or its advantages. Samuel stopped for a moment. Billy, can you explain this silly-ass birth ceremony? Billy then said, why is it silly? These were their customs and practices, they probably think that your Sabaoth is a fairy tale, and they do. But sure. A royal physician signs an official document confirming the newborn's gender, weight, and birth time. A palace official will bring this document out of the hospital, and this is the first sign the world will get that the royal baby has arrived. And it's then handed to a messenger who will take it to the palace under guard. They put the notice into a frame at the palace, positioned on an easel and placed in the palace forecourt, at which time the world will know the gender of the baby. However, it could take anywhere from up to 8 days before the new arrival's name is announced. After the announcement, a brief statement by the king of the child's birth outside the hospital. Samuel interrupted Billy, "You probably right about your statement you just made. But I know what I know, seen what I know and felt what I know about Sabaoth. It's what they know, so I will take my statement back, about it being silly, it's their traditions. Traditions of men handed down for generations. Anyways, thanks, I got it from here." Billy said, "You're welcome." Samuel continues, at the hospital, the king made his announcement of the child. Although they were at the ceremony, Chi's parents were supposed to be up there with the royal family. But because they were Wakatilians, they were standing in the back of the crowd. They minted 5,000 silver pennies to mark the royal birth. Samuel pulled a silver penny out of his pocket, and handed it to Cush, like this one. The king's artillery sounded celebratory gun salutes in the royal park with 41-round salute, and again by the honorable artillery at the Tower of Ireland with a 62-round salute. In keeping with their traditions. It is said that when she left the royal hospital, they burned her sheets, because she was Wakatilian. She appeared on the steps of the building with her newborn as the crowd looked on. The ceremony lasted for 2 days before Chi's family was to head back home. Chi's father, Shaka, approached her with tears in his eyes. "I will return in 8 months to take the baby and perform my family ceremonies in the Holy of Holies. Don't let anyone know, not even your Uncle Mal. Do not let them know where the baby or I am. Because it is of great importance to Sabaoth that no one knows her whereabouts. You will find out why I have asked of you such requests later. I also need all royal documents of her birth and 500 silver pennies." She smiled and said, "It is so." After 8 months, Shaka showed up at the palace, and with open arms she had everything he asked for. He didn't stay there long enough to see the king, and she never saw her daughter again. 3 miscarriages followed, and King Joseph returned to his old ways of having orgies and entertaining other women. The king's love for Chi was gone, and so was his loyalty to her. I also heard, not once did he ask about Anaya. Shaking his head, Samuel repeated himself, "Not once." By this time, the full effects of the Abenians' absence caused civil unrest and violence to take over the land. Soon after, Chi was taken and charged with high treason and sent to the highest court in Ireland by her accusers. She was tried before a jury of peers, including her former betrothed and her Uncle Mal. Like I told you before, everyone who is your family ain't your family. The court proceedings were long and intense, with both sides presenting their arguments and evidence. In the end, Queen Chi was found guilty of high treason, adultery, inciting a coup, witchcraft, and a bunch of other lies according to old Ireland laws, and sentenced to life imprisonment in a remote dungeon in the mountains. King Joseph didn't give a damn by the verdict and didn't even try to appeal to the Abenians for clemency. However, the king's reputation was tarnished, and he lost much of his support among the people of old Ireland. Again, he didn't care. Meanwhile, Queen Chi languished in her cell, day after day. She never gave up hope that one day she would be reunited with her daughter and her people. In the quiet moments, she would often think back to the time when she first met King Joseph and how everything had seemed so perfect. But now, everything was different, and she had paid a heavy price for her forbidden love. After a formal lackluster apology in front of the citizens with all the balloons and whistles by King Joseph, old Ireland was punished for their sins but eventually united with the Abenians once again. To show the Abenians their loyalty, Chi charges were upgraded and she was beheaded days later. Cush had forgotten he held the silver penny in his hand as he handed it to Samuel. "Wow, these Abenians sure do hate us." "But why?" Samuel said, "Yes, they do. You will find out. Just wait. Remember, like always, and I'll say it again, history repeats itself." Martha interrupted them when she entered the living room with some fresh squeezed lemonade. "Here, old man, y'all gone need something to drink with all that talking y'all doing." Samuel smiled. "Thanks, old lady, I sure do." Taking a drink, Samuel smacked his lips as Martha handed Cush a glass. Samuel continued, "This rang true for the Wakatilians of Ireland." He paused. "Martha, this here lemonade is something else." Martha smiled, "Thanks babe." Samuel continued as he smacked his lips again, "This rang true for the Wakatilians of Ireland, and the life in Ireland was cruel toward the Wakatilians. For the next 200 years after Chi's death, the Abenians took revenge on the Wakatilians. Because of what she had done. The silver pennies were thrown out, but the Wakatilians found them and kept them for themselves. It was so bad that they started immigrating to the Americas as a way to get out. But even that wasn't a joyful event. Because they were Wakatilians, they could not travel the way the Computans did. And on top of that, the Computans started spreading rumors that they carried contagious diseases. Computans hired desperate Anakitas to ship them on old rusty naval ships as indentured servants to the Americas for the price of 1 year of servitude. As it showed lucratively, the cost increased every year as these immigrants rushed to get out of the country. The first servants imported into the Americas were just a few hundred Wakatilians promising to send for their relatives afterward. They referred to these laborers as servants, not as slaves, because many agreed to work for land and rights. Little did they know it was just empty promises and straight-up lies. Samuel continued with his story, telling Cush about how the Wakatilians eventually formed their own nation, and each nation separated into clans and refused the term Wakatilians. The nations was founded on the principles of unity, equality, and justice for all its people, regardless of their background. The nations thrived and prospered, and it became a beacon of hope and inspiration for all oppressed people around the world.